Hello, everyone, and welcome back to this week's episode of the Rosa and Rubini podcast. My name is Manas Chavla, and as always, I'm really pleased to be joined by CEO and Head of Research, Brunella Rosa. This week, we're discussing perhaps a geopolitical issue that we've been talking for the better part of 2.5 years now. The war in Ukraine. Is the West losing the war in Ukraine? Brunella, in this week's newsletter, you point out that this war has been going on for about 815 days thus far. I still remember when it first started, there were all these sort of predictions that it might end in the first 3 days, the first week, the first 3 weeks, and it's been such an intractable conflict. We heard a lot of things might happen sort of in the summer, an attempted Ukrainian spring counteroffensive, moves by the Russians as well. Could you summarize what's happened lately and where that leaves us sort of in military terms?
Yeah, very quickly. I mean, as you said, it's been 2.5 years, um, and with many phases, like every war that long. Initially, there was a surprise by the Russian, then the Ukrainian actually staged the resistance that the Russians didn't expect. Actually, were able to mount a counteroffensive in the spring to autumn last year. Unfortunately, that counteroffensive was not as effective as they thought. So after the winter is actually now the Russian turn to start a new offensive that is actually unfortunately working. So some of
Mm.
the lines that on which both sides were kind of staying have been surpassed by the Russian, and this is very well exemplified by the fall of the Kharkiv region. And Zelensky said that this could be only the beginning. He said the first wave of what could be, he said, a brutal summer.
Yeah, I mean, given all this sort of this whole situation, can the West really win this war? And what does winning actually mean?
Yeah, that's the most complicated part. So, if this means pushing Russia back to the borders of February 2022, and let alone reconquering Crimea that was actually annexed in 2014, I don't think this is gonna happen, especially if the West, by which we mean effectively the US and its European allies, um, continues to underinvest, let's use this term, uh, compared to Russia on the war. Now, Khodorkovsky, one of the most relevant dissidents, in fact, lives abroad, has recently released a video in which he says that Russia is investing more than 5%, he calculates 5.4% of its GDP in the war, while the West is barely investing 0.25% of, say, the EU GDP. When you put together the US aid, this means that Russia has a ratio to the West in terms of spending for the war of 2.5 to 1, so more than twice as much. If you take out the US, as it happened in the last few months, because the US Congress was not approving the new package, the ratio goes up to 4 to 1, 4 times as much. Now, what Khodorkovsky says is, how on earth do you think that you can win a war in which your enemy is investing so much more, and the population, of course, is totally imbalanced? He also makes some ratio on the population that I'm not kind of repeating here, but it's obvious. Russia is what, 140 million people country, Ukraine is what, 40 million. Then Russia lost some soldiers and some population, those who didn't want to be conscripted. But Ukraine, of course, much more in terms of soldiers and civilians, but also those who fled the country. So
Mhm.
the ratio has increased massively. If a country in a war between two countries in which one invests so much more militarily has such bigger population, therefore soldiers, potential soldiers, I mean, this only sends a very strong signal that it's very hard to win that war.
Yeah. Some of the recent numbers I saw are, Russia's producing shells 3 times faster than the United States,
Yes.
Europe, Ukraine combined, has 4 times more sort of manpower in terms of future recruitment numbers. So there's a clear sort of imbalance there on the military front. I mean, then you come to talking about the international stage and sort of what's going to happen with support from the Chinese, but also most importantly, the upcoming American elections. How do you think those two could sort of change the calculus of the war?
Yeah, they are the biggest problem. So the Western support to Ukraine is wavering and is always wobbling. It's subject to people's feelings. Of course, at the very beginning, yes, we need to support Ukraine. And then as soon as you realize how much it costs, how long it takes, the cost of human lives and this and that, then people say, yeah, Ukrainians important are more important, or there are more important issues domestically and so on. On the other hand, Putin, in spite of all this brutality, he can go to China, meet the president Xi Jinping, be very warmly welcomed by him, and not just shaking hands, but we're talking about hugs, double hugs that all the sinologists and the criminologists in the world have tried to interpret. What does it mean? What are the historical precedents of a Chinese president hugging somebody not once but twice? All that kind of stuff. It's been investigated at the time. But all it says one thing: China is perfectly aware of what's going on there and is supporting, while the West, in particular the US, but it's also in parts of the EU, but definitely in the US, is a bit ambivalent. There are periods in which they say, no, we cannot absolutely allow the Russians to take over Ukraine, and there are other periods in which they, are we sure? How much does it cost, and so on. If you think in terms of the investment, so to speak, in international security or keeping Russia at bay, actually the war in Ukraine is relatively cheap, if one can use this economic language, whether it's appropriate for this situation, but is a very good investment compared to what we would be having an all-out war confrontation with the enemy, not just going through some proxy countries. Another example I can give is the following. Putin has already started to dispute the maritime borders with the Baltic republics, which, let's not forget, are part of the EU, the Eurozone, and NATO. Now, this is the key message. If Putin gets over Ukraine, it will not stop there. So there's no appeasement possible. We learned this in Munich in 1938. It's already been done. The idea was, let's give the Sudetenland to Hitler, it will stop. No, that was the beginning of the biggest war. So unfortunately, you need to make this sort of, if I can use again this language, investment to prevent further resources to be devoted to bigger war. This is the key thing that I think Biden got right, because he's old. People always complain, it's too old, he shouldn't run, he's not up. Yes, all this might be true, it doesn't matter. He has historic memory. And he said, have you ever seen a major war in Europe in which the US has not been dragged down big time? Then boots on the ground, then losing soldiers. I mean, just read history. You don't need to reinvent reality. Let me finish, since we are talking about the US, with this. Putin and Xi can only count on the option value of waiting if Trump wins. The vice versa is not true. We know that Putin is going to be there for the next 6 to 12 years. Xi Jinping is going to be there for life. So only the other side changes. And these guys can count on a much more favorable president, which is Trump, which is the reason why Ian Bremmer, the famous celebrated geopolitical analyst at Eurasia, said, let me give you the best scenario for Ukraine. To be partitioned. Some part will remain with the bigger part of Ukraine. The other part, unfortunately, is lost. Then he says that's the best case scenario. The worst case scenario is a lot worse than this. I think we should remember this. One can be more optimistic than Bremer and say, oh, I mean, probably this is a super upside scenario in which Ukraine doesn't lose any of its territory, including Crimea. I think I kind of agree with him. I think we are late for that. In the best case scenario, given the situation that is already now, I think it's worse. Ukraine might need to lose part of its territory. They don't like the idea, but they cannot resist indefinitely to Russia, especially if the West doesn't get involved. And I finish with this thought. It's an asymmetric war. Russia can do almost whatever they want to Ukraine. Ukraine cannot react the same way because they fear the nuclear reaction. So, and the
Yeah.
West cannot intervene directly because otherwise would be direct confrontation later on.
Yeah, and we've seen time and time again the sort of nuclear question become more and more real as I think Russia was testing out sort of just this past weekend sort of exercises for nuclear sort of battlefield deployments. And certainly what you mentioned, you know, the window, the political window of what is acceptable and politically palatable has changed a lot in the last 2 years. We're now, you know, sort of both sides are gradually coming to the conclusion that actually negotiations and, you know, potential sort of partition of the territory might really be the only realistic best case scenario at hand. So, you know, much to watch, particularly as sort of Russia's recent sort of offensive into Kharkiv region advances in the next few weeks to months. But as always, Bruno, thank you so much for your time and insight.
Thank you. Until next time.